Hi, friends and colleagues. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and we're so pleased that you're with us today for our Hanukkah webinar for rabbis, Difficult Choices, the Challenge of Prioritizing Mitzvot, with our teacher, Rabbi Eliezer Diamond. And a special welcome if you're joining us for the first time for this webinar. I want to just highlight a couple upcoming programs before we begin. I hope that you've received emails. We launched a major expansion of our live online mini courses this year. We had 3 already in the fall. Some of you are currently taking the one with Joel Roth, and we have 4 new ones coming up in the spring with David Fishman, Danny Nevins, Ben Summer, and Barbara Mann, 4 terrific faculty on a huge range of subjects. So we hope that you will join us. The one with Ben Summer is particularly geared towards rabbis, but rabbis are obviously welcome in all of them, and we have rabbis taking all of them. So you'll receive information on that in the follow-up email to this webinar, along with information about our turnkey curriculum, The Ethical Life. We're now in 102 locations, so we're very proud of that, and hope that you will all teach this terrific course that we've created for adult learning, and especially in synagogue settings, but other places as well. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the other staff, JTS staff in the room with me, our colleague Rabbi Tim Bernard, who's our Director of Digital Learning, who creates this series for you, and our new media staff, Larry and Marissa. So our program today will last for about an hour and 15 minutes. If you haven't already printed the sources, you can download them using the link right above the video on your screen. Rabbi Diamond will answer specific questions, clarification questions during the webinar if you have them, and then we'll have a period for general Q&A at the end. You can submit your questions in the chat window below the video box at any time. That's the best way to submit your questions. If you have a problem with that for some reason, you can email them to rabbinicresources@jtsa.edu, rabbinicresources@jtsa.edu, and please put webinar question in the subject line. We may not have time to answer every question, but we will get to as many as we can. So on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Diamond. Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Diamond is the Rabbi Judah Nadich Associate Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. He's the author of Holy Men and Hunger Artists, Fasting and Asceticism in Rabbinic Culture. And he's contributed to several reference works, including the chapter on Torah study in the Observant Life, which I'm sure is on many of your bookshelves. Rabbi Diamond's recent scholarship includes editing Professor Louis Ginsburg's commentary on Yerushalmi Psachim and issues of environmental law and ethics. He has taught in a variety of settings, including Stern College, RRC, 92nd Street Y, and several Ramah camps. He was ordained at YU and received his doctorate here in Talmud at JTS. And thank you so much for teaching us today.
Thank you, Julia. So as about 5 minutes ago, I can wish everyone a good afternoon. Let me just share with you my game plan. We will be looking at the subject, which is the title of the session, Difficult Choices, the Challenge of Prioritizing Mitzvot. In the process of preparing, though, I came across some issues that interested me, and I think will interest you, and you might even find something in there that you would want to share with your congregants. So I'll take about 10 minutes to share with you some of these findings, and then we will move on to the topic at hand. So we all know that one of the brachot that we recite over Neirot Hanukkah is She'asa Nisim L'Avotenu, and probably you continue Bayamim Hahem Bazman Hazeh. Some of you may continue Bayamim Hahem Uvizman Hazeh. I remember seeing over the Knesset during Hanukkah a big sign, I think in lights, that said Bayamim Hahem Uvizman Hazeh, and clearly that was meant to be interpreted as there have been miracles in the past and there are miracles in this day. That almost certainly is not the meaning of the bracha, not that we can choose to understand it that way homiletically, but I wanted to show you that historically the meaning is different. So the first source is from a Mishnah in Brachot, chapter 9, Mishnah 1. Haro'eh makom shena'asu bo minisim l'Yisrael omer, Baruch, and so on and so forth. she'asa nisim la'avotenu bamakom hazeh. So when I see a place where miracles have occurred, then that should trigger this bracha of thanksgiving, right? And there are many such brachot in the 9th chapter of brachot. We could call it hoda'ah, thanks for the miracle. We could call it shevach, praising God who performs such miracles. But that is a bracha. And of course, if you look at it and you think of Sha'asa Nisim, you see that Sha'asa Nisim has the same structure. Sha'asa Nisim lavotenu bizman hazeh, which I'll show you is, according to some, the original form of the bracha. So if that's the form, instead of saying bamakom hazeh, you're saying bazman hazeh. We can see that form in source number 2, the She'iltot, a work that was written in Bavel in the 8th century. So it's Aramaic. I'll just read it in the English. When a day arrives on which a miracle occurred for the Jewish people, such as Hanukkah and Purim, one is obliged to recite the bracha, Baruch Asher Asa Nisim Lavotenu Bazman Hazeh. There's also discussion of whether it's Bizman, Bazman. Let's just leave it with Bazman. So again, you see that in this form it parallels the structure of the bracha in source number 1, and that there's no Bayamim Hahem. It's just Bazman Hazeh. And probably, so clearly the bracha can't mean, Bazman Hazeh can't mean in our time. In this bracha, clearly the meaning is, we thank God who performed miracles at this time of year. And just as Bamakom Hazeh means in this place, Bazman Hazeh means in this time of year. Now, in the, there are variants in manuscripts of the She'iltot, in the edition that was produced by Samuel Mirsky, and those are the Aleph Beit Gimel. So one version is Sha'asa Nisim Lavotenu Bayamim Ha'elu, then Bayamim Hahem, and then Bayamim Hahem Uvizman Hazeh. Now, I think that the first two versions were intended to head off a possible misunderstanding of the bracha. Because if you look at rabbinic language, I did not look at every single case of Zman Hazeh, but all of those that I looked at, Zman Hazeh in fact means in our own time. It doesn't mean in this time of year in the past. So it may be that these versions of the bracha were meant to make it clear that the bracha is thanksgiving for something that happened then, Bayamim Hahem, or Biyamim Ha'elu at this time of year, but not now. And ironically, the third form may be, which presumably is a hybrid form, combined two forms of the bracha that were circulating, one Bayamim Hahem and one Bazman Hazeh, presumably, or possibly, Bayamim Hahem is there to clarify that Bizman Hazeh means in this time of year and not now. In other words, the bracha is saying, God did miracles for us in those days, and specifically, taking the Vav as Vav HaPerush, an explanatory Vav, and specifically in this time of year. So God performed the miracle in those days, and specifically in this time of year. However, many of us have come to understand it to mean that God has performed miracles in the past, and in this time, then we have to fill in the rest of the sentence, God continues to perform miracles. There's nothing wrong and everything right with understanding the bracha in this way. It's simply a technical point that I thought might be of interest to some of you. Now let's look on page 2. So here, as I indicate at the top of the page, I want to look at a few sources that deal with a question. And the question is, what exactly is the function of Sha'asa Nisim La'avotenu Bazman Hazeh? And I've suggested here a commemorative blessing, right? In other words, along the lines of Kiddush, right? Kiddush commemorates or indicates what this day is, that is Shabbat. Along similar lines, Sha'asa Nisim is a way of commemorating or acknowledging, maybe is a better word, that this is a particular time it is the time of commemoration of miracles. The second possibility is that this bracha makes clear the purpose of lighting the candles. Certainly in rabbinic times, people lighted candles, really lamps, we should say, many, many times, and for all sorts of purposes. By reciting She'asa Nisim, we are making clear the reason we are doing this is to commemorate the miracle of Hanukkah. And of course, you know that originally the Hanukkah candles, lights, were to be placed at one's doorway so that it was clear that this was being done as a mitzvah and not simply to light a light. And it's really only, honestly, I didn't check this. I once knew this, but I don't know it at the moment. But sometime in the late Middle Ages, it is only then that Chanukiot came into being. In other words, until that time, I don't know, let's say it's the 16th century, but I'm not really sure. There's a major piece on this in Daniel Sperber's Minhagei Yisrael, I think the 5th volume, maybe the 6th, where he discusses this. So it's only when Chanukiot come into being that it's obvious that I'm not lighting this to provide light to my house, but rather as a mitzvah. But before that time, it was only through the placement of the light and this bracha that it was made clear that this was the purpose. And finally, the other possibility is a response to an act of Pirsume Nisa, of publicizing the miracle, a phrase, by the way, that only appears in the Babylonian Talmud. So if it is the first, it may be that I don't need the lighting of the Chanukiah at all, the lights at all, to recite She'asa Nisim. And in fact, if you look at source number 5, page 5, source number 7, you see that the Meiri says, one of the Rishonim from Provence, southern France in the 13th century, says, if someone who is unable to light the Hanukkah candles and is not in a place where he can view them, there are those who say that he should recite for himself She'asa Nisim and She'achiyanu on the first night of Hanukkah and She'asa Nisim on the subsequent evenings. And this seems to me to be right. So here we have someone saying that even if you don't have Hanukkah candles, because it's Hanukkah, you say She'asa Nisim. And that sounds like the first possibility, that it's reacting to the specific time. Where is it now? It's maybe I didn't include this, but Amram Gaon in a Sidur from the 9th century also says that the reason that She'asa Nisim is recited over the menorah is because, unlike Shabbat or Yom Tov, we don't have a liturgy in which it can be placed, so we do it together with the lighting of the candles. But again, he doesn't specifically see a connection between the two. I'm going to skip over the second possibility, and let's talk about the third, which is that saying She'asa Nisim is a response to an act of Pirsume Nisa. So if you look at source number 1, Rab Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rav, one who lights Hanukkah candles must recite a blessing. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, one who sees lit Hanukkah candles must recite a blessing. So one who lights the Hanukkah candle says, Lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah, and She'asa Nisim. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says, if you only see the candles, you recite She'asa Nisim. Now, who is this person who's seeing the candles and reciting the bracha? Is it even someone who's going to light candles later on, or only someone who's not going to light candles later on? So, not surprisingly, there's a debate about this. I've provided you with the sources and some questions, and basically you can see the various views for yourself. But what's striking about this passage is that part of lighting the Hanukkah candles is, we know, Persume Nisa, right, to publicize to other people the miracle of Hanukkah, but it's sort of a variation on charity starts at home. The first person who has to see and react to the miracle is me, is the person who lights or the person who sees the light. And we can say that in that sense, remember we said before that there's a parallel between She'asa Nisim Lavotenu Bazman Hazeh and Uvamakom Hazeh. What generates the bracha of Bamakom Hazeh, of thanking God for the miracle? It's seeing something concrete. Even if I'm not there, I know that God performed the miracle there. But what's generating the bracha is that I'm seeing a specific place where the miracle took place. And that generates the bracha. Similarly, I know that this is the time of year when the miracle of Hanukkah took place. But what generates the bracha is seeing something concrete, namely the Hanukkah lights, that causes me to recite the bracha of She'asa Nisim. So one final point about this, and this is the source of this is the source where is this source? Okay, I might have mistakenly, where the custom of lighting the candle and then saying She'asa Nisim. Okay, somehow I may have excluded it, but what that source says, and some people follow this custom, is that when you light the Hanukkah candle, you say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, then you light the first candle, and then you say She'asa Nisim. So what is the idea? The idea is, yes, I'm lighting the menorah in order to publicize the miracle to others. However, the first person to whom I have to publicize the miracle is to myself. And therefore, I light the Hanukkah candles. I say Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah. I light the first candle. I see the first candle, so I am experiencing Persume Nisa, and then I recite She'asa Nisim Lavotenu Bazman Hazeh. So these are technical issues, but I want to suggest some drush based on this discussion, which is one of my favorite jokes is that a rabbi is giving a fire and brimstone sermon, and after the sermon, one of the congregants comes over to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, you really told them off. Sometimes we are very aware of what we think other people need to know and what other people need to do, and we're less aware of the fact that we need to start with ourselves, that we are in need of self-examination." And I think that this view that when I light Nerot Hanukkah, I should wait until I have lit one and have looked at it and then said She'asa Nisim is, among other things, a way of saying that when I have an obligation, I should first reflect, even if the purpose of performing that obligation is in some significant sense to inspire others. First, I need to make sure that I myself am inspired. I am the one who first and foremost has the obligation to understand the meaning of and take in the significance of what I'm doing. And we all know that it is much more likely that I'm going to inspire people if I am inspired myself than if I'm not. So now let's move on to the major topic. And so that is, okay. Oh, you know what? The source that I was referring to we're not going to read it now. It was on page 4, source 5. That's the source where the Ritba talks about the custom of saying the blessing of Lahadlik Ner, then lighting the candle, and then the other two, Shasani Sim and Shachiyanu, should be recited after one begins to light. So, okay, that's sort of one step up for me. I didn't forget to include the source, I just forgot where it was. So that's progress of a sort. Okay, let's look at now at page 6. Excuse me. And let's look at the sources having to do with preference and priority. So I'll start by putting it in a larger context. Excuse me, philosophers discuss the issue of moral dilemmas. And there are two kinds of moral, and the problem of moral dilemmas is that there are two things that are of value, and I have to choose. I mean, I always say that if my choice is between, helping an old lady across the street or becoming a serial murderer, it's pretty clear what choice I should make. But those aren't the complicated choices. The complicated choices are the ones where there are two goods, and now I have to choose between the two. And as we'll see, there are two ways in which that problem can come up. One is I can only perform one of the mitzvot. The other is it is possible for me to perform both of the mitzvot, but now the question becomes the order in which I should perform them. And we're going to look at sources that address both of those issues and try to understand a little bit about why the rabbis make the choices that they make. In some cases, they're explicit about it. Actually, in most cases, they're explicit about it, but it's interesting to see what their hierarchy of values is and to see what choices they make and why. So, on page 6, Rava says, in source number 1, Amar Rava, Pshitali, it's obvious to me, Ner Beito, Ner Hanukkah, Ner Beito Adif, Mishum Shlom Beito. That if I have enough oil, or I can purchase enough oil for my Shabbat candles or my Hanukkah candles, it is clear that I should purchase oil for my Shabbat candles, Mishum Shlom Bayit, which I've translated here as domestic harmony. The point is that that domestic harmony, right, the Shabbat candles, what is the innovation of Shabbat candles? Generally speaking, in the Talmudic period, people got up with the sun and went to sleep with the setting of the sun. The rabbi said that it is important to have a Friday night meal. So to have a Friday night meal, you need light. It's not an oneg, it's not pleasurable to have a meal without lights. And as we can see from this passage, for some people, this was a major expense. One of the things that I say to my students is, we can't really understand the kind of poverty that existed in the rabbinic period based on what constitutes poverty in our own time. Well, that's not entirely true. There are countries where the level of poverty is really the one that's being portrayed here. But it is possible that a family only has enough oil for one of these two purposes, to light Shabbat candles or to light Hanukkah candles. And what the rabbis say, and this is really not surprising, that the value of a home in which there is harmony, in which there is light, in which there is Shabbat, it's a Shabbat Shalom, comes before Ner Chanukah. The next passage says, Ner Beito v'Kiddush Hayom, Ner Beito Adif. If the choice is between Hanukkah candles and reciting Kiddush, I also choose, what did I say? Shabbat candles and Kiddush, then the Ner Shabbat comes first. And again, because Shlom Bayit is of more significance than Kiddush. Now here the Rishonim are troubled, or some of them are troubled, by the following. Kiddush is a biblical obligation. Shabbat candles are a rabbinic obligation. They find it strange that a rabbinic obligation would set aside a biblical obligation. Because remember, in this case, we're talking about an instance in which only one of the mitzvot will be fulfilled. So there are two ways in which the Rishonim go. One way in which some Rishonim go is to say, actually, even though I'm not going to recite Kiddush over wine, right, because the purchase that I would make for Kiddush is the wine for Kiddush, so even though I'm not going to have wine, I'll be able to fulfill the biblical obligation anyway, either because, according to some, I'm allowed to recite Kiddush over a loaf of bread rather than wine, or because I have fulfilled the biblical obligation of Kiddush during the Tefillah, during Ma'ariv, when I recited Vayechulu. Now, this is a problem which creates another, this is a solution that creates another problem. That is, on the one hand, now the Rishonim can say to themselves, the Talmud is not really saying that a rabbinic obligation is setting aside a biblical obligation, because I actually am going to fulfill the biblical obligation in another way, either through making Kiddush on the loaf of bread or through my tefillot. The problem that's created is then, what's the point of the sugya altogether? Since I'm going to be fulfilling the mitzvah of Kiddush anyway, just not with a cup of wine, what does it really mean to say that Ner Beito is setting aside Kiddush? So there are Rishonim who say that no, Ner Beito sets aside Kiddush altogether, even though I'm not able to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush in any way. I still put Ner Beito first. And again, setting aside the technical issues, I think that's very striking in terms of rabbinic values, and we'll see this again in other cases, which is that there are many instances in which interpersonal obligations set aside, word that I'm not crazy about, but I will use it, set aside ritual obligations, or mitzvot bein adam l'chavero, set aside mitzvot bein adam l'makom. It's not always true, but it's true often enough, and it's something that we should take to heart. I mean, I'll just give an example from my own life. If anyone tells me that he or she keeps a kosher home, I eat in that person's home. I don't say, well, where does your meat come from? Where does your cheese come from? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my reason is that the mitzvah of Shabbat and the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat and of eating together with others, for me, doesn't supersede kashrut. I'm not going to eat in the home if someone tells me, actually, I don't keep kosher. But it supersedes a certain kind of punctiliousness about kashrut, which then shuts me out of other people's homes, such that I can't celebrate Shabbat with them and break bread with them and converse with them. So you can agree or not, but that's my approach, and it is related to the kind of priority that is being suggested here. So now the Talmud goes on and says, Ba'i Rava, Ner Hanukkah v'Kiddush Hayom Mahu. What happens if I can either purchase oil for my Hanukkah lights, or I can purchase wine for my Kiddush? So although the first two were obvious, how to resolve the first two were immediately obvious to Rava, this one's less obvious. Why? Kiddush Hayom Adif Ditadir. Maybe Kiddush Hayom takes priority because it is a frequently performed commandment. And we have a principle that appears a number of times in the Talmud, Tadir, v'she'eno tadir kodem, that if you have a frequently, an obligation that comes frequently and one that comes less frequently, the frequent obligation comes first. O dilma, or perhaps ner Hanukkah adif mishum pirsume nisa. Maybe the importance of publicizing the miracle of ner Hanukkah is so important that it takes precedence over purchasing wine for Kiddush. Batar di baya, after having considered the question, Hadar Pashta, Rava then solved it for himself and said, here's, I think, the answer. Ner Chanukah adif, mishum pirsume nisa. Ner Chanukah comes first because of the obligation of publicizing the miracle. And here again, I think that this discussion has broader application, which is that, let's say in programming or teaching in a synagogue, there may be classes that we teach on a regular basis. And then there's some program that we feel will attract a great number of people, but it might interfere somehow with the regular teaching and classes that go on. So what happens? And I think what this sugya should make us sensitive to is to consider the relative importance of these two obligations and goals. And here we're saying Pirsume Nisa trumps the weekly obligation of reciting Kiddush. But whenever I look at questions of this kind, my reaction is to say, the question has been resolved in this particular case. But for me, it doesn't mean that the issue has been totally resolved. And each case has to be considered on its merits. So when cases like this come up, I have to ask myself, what is the importance of following the regularly scheduled program, and how do I weigh that against doing something special that will have an effect on that ongoing program? Not suggesting an answer, just raising the question, raising our consciousness, as we used to say in the 60s. So now we have in the next source, really somewhat of a tangent, but let's take a look at them, which is, introduces a different problem from the previous source. And let's see that. Yesh lo ner lishtehem. I have enough oil for the Hanukkah candles and the Shabbat candles. Vinistapek ezo mehem hadlaka kodemet. And now I'm not sure which of them comes first. So we already said that Shabbat candles come before Hanukkah candles. But that meant we only have enough oil for one of them. We can only do one of them. Here we can do both. But this is a second question that I mentioned before. What is the priority? Which comes first? Vinistapek ezo mehem hadlaka kodemet. So which do I light first? Yir'eh ligdolei hadorot, it seems to the great scholars, shener Shabbat kodem shehu tadir. That is, just as if we can only perform one of those miracles, one of those obligations, we light Nerot Shabbat, also in terms of the order in which they're performed, Ner Shabbat comes first, Shehu Tadir. V'chol she'ein ba'afka'at pirsum hanes Tadir kodem, and since we're not going to set aside the mitzvah of Pirsume Nisa, publicizing the miracle, because we are going to light Hanukkah candles, Nerot Shabbat come first. Then, for a sort of technical reason, others disagree. The Gonei HaRishonim, the early Gonim, gave precedence to the Hanukkah lights for a different reason. Namely that in their view, one who lights Shabbat candles has already accepted upon herself the sanctity of Shabbat, and therefore subsequent lighting of the Hanukkah candles would be forbidden. Moreover, even if one were to argue that is permitted, it is not seemly to do so, or as they say in Yiddish, is pasnish. Just doesn't look right to light Hanukkah candles after you've already lit Shabbat candles. And we're familiar with this from the custom of lighting the candles before reciting the bracha on Neirot Shabbat. The idea being that once you recite the bracha, then it is somehow Shabbat already and you shouldn't light candles. So in this regard, one of my favorite rulings in the Shulchan Aruch is the question arises whether after Shabbat, when you get home, which do you light first, the Hanukkah candles or the Havdalah candle? And the poskim say, Da'aved kamar aved, uda'aved kamar aved. Now it's your problem. Choose what you want to do. We've resolved so many questions. Here's one for you. You figure it out. In source number 3, this question of priority is used to explain a practice with which probably everyone is familiar, but you haven't necessarily thought about it. So let's say it's Hanukkah, and it's Shabbat, and it's also Rosh Chodesh. So we have 3 different Torah readings. What is the order of the Torah readings? So obviously, the weekly Torah reading comes first because that is Tadir. What about the other 2 readings? And third, the question is, which Haftarah do we recite? The Haftarah for Rosh Chodesh or the Haftarah for Hanukkah? So let's see what Tosafot says in source number 3. The view of Rav Shimshon ben Avraham of Sens, the Rosh Mishans, is that when Rosh Chodesh Tevet falls on Shabbat, so it's Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat, and Hanukkah, one should read from the book of Zechariah, in other words, the Haftarah normally read on Shabbat Hanukkah, in order to publicize the miracle, Pirsume Nisa, rather than the Haftarah for Rosh Chodesh, which fits in with what we saw in the previous, in the passage in Shabbat, in source number 1, that Pirsume Nisa comes before, takes precedence over some other mitzvot, including those that are more frequent, right? Because Rosh Chodesh is more frequent than Chanukah, and nonetheless, Zechariah takes precedence over the Haftarah of Rosh Chodesh. Moreover, given that the maftir is the reading for Chanukah, the Haftarah should be one that is connected with the maftir reading, since in fact we read Shabbat, we read Rosh Chodesh, and we read Haftarah, Chanukah in terms of what we read from the 3 Torot. The Haftarah should be connected with the last Torah reading, and the final Torah reading was Hanukkah, so that's another reason to read the Hanukkah reading. But now he says, as for why we read the Rosh Chodesh reading before the Hanukkah reading, therefore apparently ignoring the principle of publicizing the miracle taking precedence, right? This seems to be a violation of or ignoring the principle of Pirsume Nisa, taking precedence. In the case of the Torah readings, it is possible to observe both obligations. This is not a question of one mitzvah setting aside another altogether. It's a question of priority. The more frequent obligation of reading the portion for Rosh Chodesh and making public the miracle by reading the portion for the Hanukkah reading. So we're not knocking one or other out of the picture. We're simply putting Rosh Chodesh, the more frequent obligation, before Hanukkah, the less frequent obligation, which is really the same as we saw in the previous source of putting Shabbat candles before Hanukkah candles when we can do both. So therefore we do both, and the more frequent obligation takes precedence. Only when it is impossible to fulfill both obligations does publicizing the miracle take precedence. Okay. Now we come to what to me is a very interesting remark by the Rosh Yosef, Rav Yosef ben Meir Te'umim, in his commentary to Shabbat 23b, where the passage that we saw before appears. Ravas discussion of priorities. Know that the question of whether Shabbat lights or Hanukkah lights have precedence is being raised only when the two obligations are temporally simultaneous. In other words, the question arises in connection with lighting the Hanukkah candles on a Friday night. So Friday night is coming up. I have two obligations, namely the Hanukkah lights and Nerot Shabbat. So in this case, we were told by Rava that the Nerot Shabbat come first. If we only can fulfill one of those two mitzvot, we fulfill the mitzvah of Nerot Shabbat. If the question is whether to purchase oil, but if the question is whether to purchase oil for the Shabbat lights for Friday night and oil for the Hanukkah lights on Sunday night, or, and this is more important, of whether to purchase oil for the Hanukkah lights Thursday night or for next evening Shabbat lamps, the relevant principle is we do not pass over commandments. Ein ma'avirin al hamitzvot. So that in the first case, it goes without saying that Shabbat lights take precedence, right? If the question is, do I buy oil for Friday night Shabbat candles or Sunday night Hanukkah candles, Shabbat candles come first. But more interestingly, in the second one should purchase oil for the Hanukkah lights. So let's see what this means. The Talmud says that if I have enough oil for Shabbat lights or Hanukkah lights, I purchase the oil for the Shabbat lights because Shalom Bayit, the well-being of the house, is more important than Pirsumei Nisa, than publicizing the miracle. But what Rav Tumim is saying is, let's say it's Thursday night, and I have the obligation of Hanukkah candles, and tomorrow night I'll have the obligation of Shabbat candles. So one might say, since I know that the obligation of Shabbat candles is coming up, then rather than buying oil for my Hanukkah candles tonight on Thursday, I should wait to buy the oil for my Shabbat candles on Friday and give that precedence. What he says is what I would like to call be in the moment. In this moment, my obligation is lighting Hanukkah candles. So it's true that there's another obligation coming up tomorrow night. And if I had those two obligations simultaneously, I would pick Shabbat candles over Hanukkah candles. But that's not what's going on. In this moment, my obligation is Hanukkah candles. And here too, I feel that there's a larger lesson to be learned, which is, as I said before, to be in the moment, that sometimes we have a task in front of us. And our mind wanders and says, tomorrow or the day after, I'm going to have another obligation. And what happens is that our energy and our attention that should be devoted to the task at hand is, at least in our minds, devoted to something that's going to happen later on, which may be extremely important and maybe in some sense is even more important than what I'm doing. But the problem here is that our obligation, as Ram Dass said, is to be here now. We have to give our full attention to the task at hand. As somebody said, and it's obvious, and I don't know why it had such an effect on me when I heard it, and it's obvious. If you're here, you can't be there. And if you're here and there, you're nowhere. That, I think, is the lesson that Rav Tu'umim is teaching us. So now let's look at another set of tensions, of competing obligations. And here, too, we're dealing with Pirsumei Nisa, the obligation to publicize the miracle. But here, the miracle, and that's being publicized, is not the Hanukkah miracle, but the Purim story, the miracle of being saved from destruction. So Rava said, "It is clear to me that the reading of the Megillah takes precedence over the temple service." So what does that mean? The priests are serving in the temple, and suddenly one of them says, "Hey, today is Hanukkah." No, doesn't say that. It says today is Purim, and we're supposed to read the Megillah. All of them are supposed to file out and go to read the Megillah rather than continuing to perform the temple service. Rather striking, and we'll come back to it. So now Rava raised the following question. Again, that issue is resolved by the Talmud, but Rava raised a different question. If one must choose between reading the Megillah or burying a mate mitzvah, and a mate mitzvah is someone who has no relatives to bury him or friends or anyone else in the neighborhood. In other words, I come across a corpse, and as far as I can tell, I'm the only person who is available to perform the burial. So which takes precedence? Does the reading the Megillah take precedence because of the importance of publicizing the miracle of Purim? Or does mate mitzvah take precedence because of one's obligation to treat others with honor and respect? I'm translating the phrase kvod habriot. So after he raised the question, once again, he resolved it. Mate mitzvah takes precedence because it has been taught, great is the obligation to show honor and respect to others, evidenced by the fact that we put aside biblical obligations in order to, that do doesn't belong there, in order to fulfill it. So this is striking. It seems that the Talmud is saying that even biblical obligations are set aside by our obligations to our fellow human beings. Now, actually, this seems to be a debate. This passage notwithstanding, it may be a debate within the Bavli, but it's certainly a debate between one view in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. That is, elsewhere in Brachot, I believe it's 19b, the Talmud, there's a statement that says that that kvod habriot comes before mitzvot d'oraita. It sets aside not only obligations but even prohibitions. So the particular case is there's someone in the marketplace, and that person is wearing a garment that is kilayim. You know that it contains a mixture of linen and wool. So the Talmud entertains the possibility, rather strange one, that maybe I should go over to that person and say, you're going to have to take off that garment immediately because it has shatnez in it. So the Talmud says, no, you don't do that. Happy that that's the conclusion reached in the Talmud. You don't do that because kvod habriot comes before and sets aside a biblical prohibition. The Talmud is amazed by this possibility, and finally the Talmud comes to the conclusion that this is only true in setting aside a rabbinic prohibition. But kvod habriot does not set aside a biblical prohibition. However, the Yerushalmi says explicitly that kvod habriot sets aside a biblical prohibition. And again, I think that this raises a very important question for us, which is that sometimes in our relationships with other people, if we're rabbis, in our relationship with congregants, how far do we go in saying, because of we don't want to embarrass somebody, or we understand the situation that someone is in, we're not going to say anything about the violation of some prohibition. How far do we go? Well, the Yerushalmi and the Bavli seem to have different points of view. And again, my point here is not to resolve these issues, but A, to raise the question, and B, to show that the rabbis themselves weren't always sure how to resolve these particular questions. And by the way, throughout this, I hope that you, if not now, later on, will reflect on situations in your own lives, personal or professional, where these kinds of questions arise. And again, not necessarily say, well, because the Talmud says this or that, this is what I'm going to do, but just sort of to problematize the situation for yourself and say, well, what are the issues here? What are the values on each side? And how should that affect, and to what extent should that affect the decision that I make? Let's look at source number 6. And here we're coming back to the initial statement in Megillah in source number 5 that says that the reading of the Megillah takes precedence over the temple service. So Rabbeinu Nisim, one of the Spanish Rishonim, 13th, 14th century, says, the temple service is set aside in order to read the Megillah, even though time left in the day to perform the temple service and read the Megillah afterward, right? So there's a block of time left in the day. It's possible to perform the temple service and still have enough time to read the Megillah. Still, you read the Megillah first and then return to the temple service. Now this itself, I think, is an important point is being made. I don't know about you, but often enough in my own life, I have something that I should do, and I say, I'll get to it. I have time. And I do something else instead, and lo and behold, I end up not having time to do the thing that I said I would have time to do. And I think that that's the idea behind what Rabbeinu Nisim is saying here, which is, if something's important, do it right away. Don't tell yourself, yeah, but I will do it. I'll get to it. If it's really important, that should be your focus. That should be the first thing that you do, because that way you know for sure that you'll do it. Now, Rabbeinu Nisim goes on to say, however, reading the Megillah takes precedence only when it is possible to complete the temple service after reading the Megillah. Otherwise, one would certainly not suspend the temple service, a biblical obligation, because of the rabbinic obligation to read the Megillah. Think of that. That's a very striking image, and one which I think most of us would find it very strange. The idea that we should interpret the passage in the Talmud as saying that the temple service is going on, but the Megillah has to be read. So guess what? Today we're not going to bring the daily sacrifice because we have to read the Megillah. Rabbeinu Nisim cannot imagine such a thing. I assume in part because this is a public obligation, and it is certainly a biblical one, and so this is unimaginable to him. However, if you look at source number 7, the Rishon LeZion by Rabbi Chaim ben Moshe ibn Attar, in his commentary to Megillah, it would seem that even if, as a result of setting aside the temple service in order to read the Megillah, the temple service is not performed at all, the reading of the Megillah takes precedence. And now he explains how that works technically. This is because the sages are empowered to uproot biblical obligations in the face of rabbinic commandments, if it is a case in which privileging the rabbinic imperative results only in the non-fulfillment of the biblical commandment, shev al ta'aseh, rather than an active violation of the biblical prohibition, as we find in many instances. Here, too, it is so. And we're familiar with this principle from instances in our religious life, such as not sounding the shofar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah if it falls on Shabbat. Okay, we have the second day, so we do it then. But the principle is, since there's a rabbinic concern that people will carry the shofar, or the same thing with the lulav and etrog, we literally set aside and do not perform a biblical obligation because of rabbinic concern. And the principle here is that if the biblical obligation is set aside in a passive fashion, you can do that. So he can imagine setting aside the temple service and not performing part of it in order to read the Megillah. Certainly very striking, and at least for some of us, counterintuitive. Right. Now we return to something that was discussed previously, and that is the law of the mate mitzvah. The law of the mate mitzvah, the definition of who is considered a mate mitzvah, is stated in Eruvin 17b and Nazir 43b. Who is considered a mate mitzvah? Anyone for whom no Jews, neither relatives nor others, are available to bury him, as when he finds a corpse while on the road. I mentioned this before. He should not abandon the body even in order to go to the city to find people to bury the dead, but rather should render himself tameh, and perform the burial, even if he is a kohen or a nazir who's normally prohibited from becoming tameh by coming into contact with the dead, or is on the way to offer the paschal sacrifice or circumcise his son. But if there were relatives or others that could attend to the mate mitzvah, such that were the kohen who came upon the corpse to call them, they would respond to his call and perform the burial. It's a long way of saying if there were other people who could do it and the kohen can contact those people, this is not a case of mate mitzvah. And the kohen, and a case in which the kohen should render himself tameh. Rather, he should call others and have them perform the burial. However, he should not move from the spot until they arrive. So we're really supposed to move on to the question, so let me just briefly make 2 points here. One is, an important question is being raised here, and one which also doesn't always have an obvious answer. When do I commit myself to doing something when it may be that other people can do it? You know, sometimes in life, we end up not organizing our lives as they should be organized because we see something that has to be done and we feel, well, it has to be done, so I'm going to do it. But sometimes the right answer is to say, in doing that, I am taking time and energy away from what I personally am supposed to be doing. And so it's important for me to see whether somebody else should be doing it, and to find that somebody else to do it, and to say, in effect, I know you want me to do it, but guess what? I have other things that I need to do. You can do it. You should do it. Sometimes, especially in the rabbinic profession, I think this is a hard decision to make. And the second thing is what is said at the end, that even, and this is sort of the flip side, that even if it turns out that this is something that other people can do and should do, I shouldn't simply say, well, other people can do it, so I'm out of here. I need to make sure that, in fact, the other people will be here and will perform the obligation. I have to hang in there until I can transfer the obligation to others. I can't simply say, since it's not my obligation, I'm out of here. I still am part of the process. I still have to do what I need to do to make sure that the other people are actually going to step up to the plate and do what they need to do. By the way, I say this in part as chair of the Talmud department. So that's a role in which issues like this, not only in that situation, but issues like that often come up, and they're not easy ones, but they're important ones. So I think we can take away from these passages, besides what they have to say about particular issues, raising our consciousness about the complexity of decisions that we sometimes have to make when we have more than one obligation or more than one goal or objective. Some of the values that might determine how we should make those decisions are suggested in these sources. And in any case, we should think about what our values are, how to prioritize them, and therefore how to act. Thanks. Questions, right?
Thank you so much, Eliezer. Just two quick housekeeping things before we start questions. One is, please, before you leave us, make sure to fill out the very brief evaluation on your screen. It's very helpful to us. And I also just wanted to note that in source C1, which is the first source on page 6, we somehow ended up with a couple translation errors. So if you're using that source in your teaching, make sure you go with the Hebrew. The translation don't worry about it, flips a little, flips a couple of the things. So just stick with the Hebrew and retranslate as needed. Okay, so I love that you put, that you were pushing us to think about these what often feels like very technical cases of, this versus that in terms of competing values. I find that, very compelling, and it's definitely going to change how I read any source like this in the future. So I wanted to ask about Tadir v'sheino Tadir, Tadir Kodem has always kind of bothered me because it really, like you were talking about the special program for the newcomers in the synagogue versus the regulars that we can take for granted. That's one scenario, but I think, I guess when I think about it in terms of not synagogue programming or something like that, but personal decisions or personal ritual activities, it seems off. So, if you're thinking about this idea of which mitzvah takes precedence as being about values competing, is there something to draw from that principle about our psychology or?
So, first, I'll just give an example that you will very much understand. You have to raise money for, say, an institution, and you need money to turn on the lights and for basic needs, or you have some wonderful new program for which you're seeking funding. Very often, people are very interested in contributing to the latter and not so much to the former. Now, it's not just a practical issue, and maybe in a sense that's not the best example, but in the religious realm, I think that the Tadir is about spiritual and religious discipline. That emphasizing Tadir is a way of reminding ourselves that actually we should not take Tadir for granted. I like to say about my own davening, I don't know what my batting average is. Certainly not 1,000. Yesterday, and I'm proud to admit this, but I was somewhere and I started davening mincha, and I suddenly realized that I had davened mincha already. So clearly that first mincha was not a very memorable mincha. So there's some days it's memorable or not. But I think we would generally agree that one of the ways that we reach the memorable minchas is by davening on a regular basis, by having a spiritual discipline. So that to me is a very, very important important value that is embodied by Tadir. Again, I don't think it should overcome everything else, but I think sometimes we do take it for granted, and we shouldn't. And frankly, if we really understand that it's a spiritual discipline, we might come to it differently. We might, instead of saying, here we go again, I might say, this is a specific unit, a specific act within a trajectory. I'm heading towards a certain kind of, want to develop myself and my religious life in a certain way. And this is a step that I'm taking, and it's a necessary step. You want to go up a stairway, 5 stairs are missing, it's going to be hard to get to the top of the stairway. So in that sense, I think actually Tadir is an extremely important principle and value.
You're making me think about when I got to the point of really feeling ownership of an understanding of the High Holiday liturgy. I just had this realization that I couldn't have come to that point without really understanding weekday and Shabbat liturgy, right? You can't, I mean, even something as simple as knowing how many brachot there are in the Amidah, it doesn't matter if you don't know that if you don't realize that Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot like changes the whole number, there's something basic that you're not even noticing about how special it is, or or that on Yom Kippur, Kiddush HaYom takes us half the day.
Right.
There's something being said there which you don't notice otherwise.
Right. Agreed.
I'm not getting questions in. We did lose, you saw our commotion before. We had some problems with our internet service provider, so I think we've lost some people who will plan to watch the recording afterwards. But if you have those questions, please send them in. Let me see. All right. I asked my question, and I am not getting additional questions. I don't know, is there anything that you want to, I guess, well, actually, I can ask you another question, unless you were just gearing up for something.
No.
The example that you gave about eating in people's homes,
Mm-hmm.
kind of relying on their self-assessment of their kashrut, you were extrapolating from that Ben Adam, mitzvot Ben Adam l'chaveiro, outweighing mitzvot Ben Adam l'makom. Would you say that that's, is it like these other mitzvot that we were looking at, where it's really a case-by-case thing, or would you say that that's sort of an overriding principle?
Definitely A and not B. And honestly, I think that's one of the major points that emerges from the material that we just saw. Because part of what, I was talking to a student, I think, last semester, and I said something to him that he found very helpful and that I think is important to say, that sometimes we think of halakha in a very static way. It's sort of out there, and tell me what to do. So I look in the book, good, bad, otherwise, yes, no, maybe. Halakha is a journey. It's a lifelong journey. And along the way, I need to grapple each time with the decision that I need to make. And to me, what emerges from these sources, I don't read these sources simply because I want to know the answer. As a halachic Jew, I do take these sources seriously in terms of guides, but I also take them seriously in terms of being engaged in the process. That what it's teaching me is, ask yourself these questions. In each case, do your best to weigh the relative importance of what you're doing. Lo ata ben charin lihi batel mimenu. I really think you can't just look it up in the book and stop there, because I think cases are often more complex than whatever is said in the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, I enjoy studying Shelot and Tshuvot much more than I enjoy studying the Shulchan Aruch, because in Shelot and Tshuvot, you get very specific cases and very specific factors, and it becomes clear that whatever it says in the Shulchan Aruch, it ain't necessarily so. In other words, you can't find something in there that tells you exactly. So, yeah, I think, and I would say, in the case that you described, Ben Adam l'chaveiro and Ben Adam l'makom, to say that Ben Adam l'chaveiro always comes first, I think, can endanger the integrity of that area of religious life. So I wouldn't go there, and I wouldn't encourage anybody to go there. But I shouldn't just say, Kashrut is important, Shabbat is important. People, I don't care. I leave them aside.
think what you're arguing about, there's a modeling here and sort of an exhortation to constantly grapple, and when we do have competing values, not to think of it as that was resolved and that's how we do it from now on, I think is helpful. It's helpful in such divisive times to kind of to keep in mind that when we're in conflict with someone else, it's because there's a core value that's driving them also, and we can't just take it for granted. I resolved this one. It has to be considered anew in each difficult situation. I've kind of a micro question that just came in from David Englander. Because the video feed cut when you were speaking earlier, you said you were about to tell one of your favorite rulings in the Shulchan Aruch, and then it cut. So they really want to know.
So it's simply that there's a question of whether you light Hanukkah candles first or the Havdalah candle first. And the Shulchan Aruch says, David Kamar Aved, David Kamar Aved. If you follow this view, it's good. If you follow the other view, it's good. And I guess in my mind, I just sort of imagine rabbis who are codifying all these laws, saying at a certain point, you know what, I don't know, can't figure this, let's punt. Let's let people out there figure out what they want to do. We're finished, doing all the hard work of resolving these questions. I'm sure that's not how the authors of the Shulchan Aruch would regard what happened, but that's where my sense of humor leads me. What can I say?
So if they did it, then you all can do it occasionally too.
Yes. Okay. That's definitely another direction in which you could go. At the risk of dipping into the treacherous waters of politics, I don't know how many people during the campaign saw a program by Van Jones called It's a Messy Thing. And what Van Jones did was he went out into red states and he gathered a bunch of people together and he said, I'm here to listen. Tell me what your view is. I want to hear. And without getting into particulars, maybe I'll just say this. I found that very powerful, and I found it to be a powerful model precisely because of what you just said. And I think there were two things going on. One, there was a willingness to believe that out there was something to be learned. And B, the way you learn is you listen. You don't, like you and I are having a conversation and you say something, and as you're talking, I'm figuring out how I'm going to show you that you're wrong, which unfortunately is how many discussions go, too many. Then that's not a discussion, that's not a learning experience. On the other hand, if I really commit myself to listening to you and to be open to the fact that you have something to teach me, then a learning experience can go on, including listening to things that are hard to hear. And obviously we're going to disagree, and sometimes we're going to say, well, here's where I think you're wrong. But the listening process is important. To me, this is the greatest contribution that halakha makes, and it might sound paradoxical, which is it's not simple. That's the greatest contribution for me that halakha makes. I know for many people the greatest contribution is, oh, now I know what to do. I don't see it that way. I think the greatest contribution is it's not simple. Or as I sometimes tell my students, the only ethical life is the examined life. You can't be ethical if you're not really thinking about what you should be doing and figuring out how to think about it.
It's a perfect note to close on. I wanted to also just let you all know, since the concept of the phenomenon of extreme poverty kind of briefly came up in one of your examples earlier. Actually, tonight at JTS, there's a program on extreme poverty in New York City, but for all those who aren't in New York City, I think the concept is this happens in many urban areas around North America. So if you're welcome to join us via live stream tonight, jtsa.edu/live. It starts at 7:30 Eastern time. So it'll be another chance to think about an issue of great social importance in the context, I think, of some of the the new takes that Rabbi Diamond shared with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chag Urim Sameach to everyone. We'll see you again soon.
Chag Urim Sameach.